The year was 1865. The frontier was a land of both opportunity and death, a world where man was tested by fire, blood, and the unforgiving wilds of nature. Nina had never imagined this life, nor had she ever dreamed of the wild heart of a man like Tsunk. Their marriage, forged in the rugged terrain of a world that asked for everything and gave nothing, was still fresh, still raw with promise. Yet, it was already a life shaped by loss and survival. She stood by the cabin's doorway, the wood rough against her palms, looking out over the vast land that stretched into the horizon. Her eyes scanned the meadow where the tall grass swayed, the scent of pine and earth heavy in the air. The morning sun bathed the valley in gold, but Nina couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled deep in her gut, a ripple in the stillness. Something felt off. She turned, glancing over her shoulder into the dim light of their home. Tsunk, her Lakota husband, was sharpening his knife by the hearth. His profile was a silhouette against the fire, his movements deliberate, focused. Nina's heart warmed at the sight of him. Strong and steady, the man who had shown her a world beyond the plains of her former life. She had come to love him more than she had known was possible. But today, that uneasy feeling pressed against her chest like an impending storm. The sudden sound of a horse's hooves broke the silence. Nina's breath caught in her throat. The horse was coming fast, the thunder of its gallop rolling across the valley. Her eyes darted to the horizon. A rider appeared, a lone figure, cloaked in dust. She could hear the whips of wind in the distance, but there was no reason for a visitor out here today. Not in the early morning. Not like this. Tsunk didn't move. He simply stood, his dark eyes narrowing as he listened to the sound of the approaching rider. His hand slowly slid to the tomahawk at his side, his posture taut like the string of a bow ready to snap. Nina could feel the shift in him, the calm before the storm. The stranger wasn't just anyone. She knew this wasn't an ordinary rider. The tension in the air thickened, sharp like the blade of his knife. "Stay inside," Tsunk murmured, his voice low but firm. But Nina didn't move. Something felt wrong. A deep instinct screamed at her to act, to run, but her legs refused to carry her. Instead, she stood frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The rider came closer. He was tall, dressed in the dusty rags of a soldier or a deserter, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat. His horse slowed as he reached the cabin, and he dismounted in one fluid motion, landing lightly in the grass. "Who are you?" Tsunk's voice was like a growl, the question carrying the force of a warning. The stranger's eyes flickered to Nina, a cruel glint of recognition flashing across his face. The man sneered, taking a deliberate step toward her. "Just a little lost lamb," he mocked, his voice dripping with menace. He reached out, grabbing Nina by the arm with a grip like iron. Nina gasped, panic surging in her chest. She tried to yank away, but his hand was a vice, and his other arm shot out, knocking her off balance. She fell, hitting the dirt with sharp sting, but she was on her feet in an instant, scrambling backward toward the cabin. "Let go of me," Nina shouted, her voice breaking with fear, but the man was unyielding. The world seemed to fall away as her heart pounded in her ears. She turned to look at Tsunk, her eyes wide with terror, but he was already moving. Fast, powerful, a blur of motion. He lunged at the man, knocking him aside with a force that sent the stranger crashing to the ground. But it was too late. The man's companions appeared out of the shadows. 3 more riders, their weapons drawn. One had a rifle leveled at Tsunk, and the others were advancing on Nina. "You shouldn't have done that," the leader growled, his hand steady on the rifle. "Now you're going to pay." In an instant, everything exploded into chaos. Tsunk drew his own knife, his movements lightning fast. He was a blur of muscle and speed, striking at the men with precision, but they outnumbered him. One of the attackers swung a heavy fist into Tsunk's side, and he staggered, briefly losing his balance. In that moment, Nina screamed, her body moving before her mind could catch up. Her captor yanked her away from the chaos, pulling her toward his horse, his grip tight enough to bruise her. The air was thick with dust, the sharp tang of gunpowder stinging her nose as the rifle cracked again. The bullet whizzed past Tsunk's ear, a warning shot. "No!" Nina cried, twisting in the man's grip, her nails digging into his hand, but he was relentless. Another man grabbed her by the other arm, lifting her off her feet as her legs buckled beneath her. The ground blurred beneath her as she fought against them, kicking, screaming, but her strength was nothing against their sheer size and strength. Tsunk's voice rang out in a deep guttural growl. "You'll regret this." He tried to move toward her, his eyes wide with mixture of rage and desperation, but the rifle press against his chest stopped him cold. One of the attackers pushed the barrel harder into his flesh. The sharpness of the moment made everything feel still, like the calm before the storm. Nina looked at Tsunk one last time, the rawness of their connection tearing through her. She saw the promise in his eyes. He would come for her. He would find her. She knew it. Then they were gone. The world became a blur of fear and force as they dragged her away, the sound of Tsunk's desperate cry ringing in her ears until it faded into the distance. The storm was coming, but Nina's heart didn't break. It burned with a fierce hope. He would find her. Tsunk's breath was heavy as he crouched low behind a cluster of rocks, his fingers digging into the earth as the distant sound of galloping horses echoed across the valley. His heart hammered in his chest, a drumbeat of fury and helplessness that only intensified as the minutes dragged on. The men who had taken Nina were too far ahead now, their trail nearly invisible in the morning fog, but the promise his mind burned bright, unyielding. He would find her. He would bring her back. The journey had already tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Every day, every hour, felt like an eternity as he pressed forward to the unforgiving wilderness. The pain in his side from where one of the men had struck him was a constant reminder of how close he had come to losing everything. But Tsunk couldn't stop. He couldn't fail her. He stood, wiping the sweat from his brow, and looked toward the distant peaks that loomed like silent sentinels. Nina's captors had headed north, and he knew every inch of this land better than any man. He had grown up on these plains, running through them as a boy, learning their rhythms and secrets. He could track a deer through a storm. He could feel the weight of a man's presence from miles away. But this, the thought of losing Nina, was different. It was an ache that twisted deeper with every step. The trail led him to a river, its dark waters rushing with the power of the spring melt. The bank was steep, slick with mud, and the currents were fast, faster than he'd anticipated. The thought of crossing it made his stomach churn, but it was his only option. His eyes scanned the distance. There, he could see the telltale signs of fresh hoofprints along the edge. The men had crossed here, not long ago. Tsunk knew this was his moment. There could be no hesitation. He gripped the strap of his rifle, adjusting it over his shoulder as he began the treacherous descent. His boots slipped a few times, the mud threatening to drag him under, but his focus never wavered. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to turn back, but he forced himself to keep moving forward. The roar of the river filled his ears as he neared the water's edge. He could see the swirling current, hear the crashing of the rocks beneath, feel the power of nature pulling at his very core. He had crossed rivers like this before, but never in a situation like this. There was no time to waste. He could hear the distant sound of his enemies still traveling. He didn't dare to lose any more ground. Tsunk made his move, leaping into the frigid water. The coldness struck like a shock to his system, but he didn't stop. He waded forward, his muscles burning as the water fought to drag him under. Every step felt like it might be his last, but he didn't care. Nothing mattered but Nina. Halfway across, the current caught his legs, pulling him off balance. For a moment, panic surged, his breath catching as he fought to stay upright. But he gritted his teeth, reaching for the rock ledge nearby. His fingers scraped against the wet stone, and with a final, desperate effort, he propelled himself forward. He staggered onto the opposite shore, chest heaving, but his gaze never left the trail ahead. The sun was beginning to dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the land. Night was falling, and with it, the sounds of the wilderness grew louder. He needed to keep moving, but his body was starting to betray him. The exhaustion was creeping in, his limbs heavy, his stomach growling with hunger, but the thought of Nina drove him forward. His feet, worn and blistered, barely felt the ground as he continued his relentless pursuit. Hours passed, the sky darkening as the stars began to reveal themselves. He pressed on, only pausing to drink from a nearby stream and force down a few handfuls of berries. His mind was a blur of rage and hope, both tangled together in a way he couldn't untangle. He could almost hear Nina's voice in his mind, soft but firm, telling him to stay strong, to keep going. He couldn't fail her. He wouldn't. As he neared a rise and land, the faintest sound reached his ears, the unmistakable thud of hooves on earth. His heart leapt. They were close. He dropped to his knees, crawling toward the edge of the hill where the sound was strongest. He held his breath, waiting, his ears strained for any clue of their position. The night was still, the air thick with tension. Then he saw them, the riders, silhouetted against the fading light, moving in a tight formation. They were heading toward a small outpost, a run-down fort hidden among the trees. Tsunk's pulse quickened. The fort had once been a place for traders, but it had fallen into disuse. It was the perfect place to hold someone captive. His breath slowed as he assessed the situation. The riders had stopped for the night, but there were at least 4 of them, maybe more. His chances of sneaking in unnoticed were slim, but he wasn't going to let that stop him. Tsunk slid back into the darkness, calculating his next move. He had no choice but to confront them, but he would need to be swift, precise. His fingers twitched, itching for feel of his bow. The men who had taken Nina were careless, but dangerous. He had to outthink them, not just overpower them. They had made a mistake by underestimating him. He closed his eyes for a moment, gathering himself. Every muscle in his body was tense, coiled, ready to spring. This would be the moment that determined everything. Nina was within reach. He could feel it in his bones. As he crept toward the fort, the sound of a bird's call broke the silence, a sharp cry that echoed through the night. The riders stirred, their attention diverted. Tsunk seized the opportunity. Moving like a shadow, he crept closer, a hunter in the night, the weight of his mission settling on his shoulders like a mantle of fire. He was so close now. His heart thundered, each beat an urgent call to action. He could see the firelight flickering through the cracks in the fort's wooden walls, smell the faint scent of smoke, hear the low murmur of voices. His pulse quickened. They were there, and Nina was somewhere inside. The storm was only just beginning. Tsunk moved like a ghost, his senses sharpened to the point of near madness. Every creak of the fort's wooden structure, every rustle of leaves in the wind, made him flinch. He had drawn closer, crouching low behind a stack of firewood, watching the men through the cracks in the walls. 4 riders. No more, but that didn't make them any less dangerous. They had Nina, and that was enough. His hands were steady, despite the pounding of his heart. His mind was clear. He had to act now. He slipped his bow from his back, the familiar weight grounding him. He could hear their voices, muffled but clear enough to make out their conversation. The leader, a gruff, scarred man with a rough voice, spoke in low tones. Tsunk's breath caught when he heard his name. "She's locked up in the back, but I don't know how long we'll be able to hold her," the man muttered. "She's a fighter. You see her eyes? She'll be trouble when she wakes up." A cold fury rippled through Tsunk's chest. They had hurt her. He could feel it in his bones. But he wasn't about to let them get away with it. The man's voice was followed by a loud laugh. "Doesn't matter. We'll sell her by the end of the week. All that matters is that she's quiet now." The others chuckled, but the sound made Tsunk's blood run hot. His fingers tightened on the bowstring. He was close. Too close. One wrong move, and they would know he was there. But he couldn't wait any longer. Tsunk crouched lower, drawing his arrow. With a slow, deliberate motion, he knocked the arrow and drew back, his arm steady as he aimed. The leader was sitting with his back to the window, facing the fire. Tsunk could make the shot, but just as his finger brushed the string, the sound of Nina's voice broke through the stillness. "Please," she whispered, her voice raw and desperate. "Don't." It was enough to freeze him. The arrow wavered in his hand. Nina, his Nina, was alive, and they were hurting her. "Shut up, girl," one of the men sneered. "You'll do as you're told, or things will get worse for you." Tsunk's anger flared. He could hear Nina's breath hitching in the distance, the sound of her fear twisting his gut. He couldn't let this go on any longer. His time was now. The men would not expect him, not with the firelight, not with the shadows surrounding them. He released the arrow with a sharp exhale, watching it sail through the air in the blink of an eye. It hit the target with a soft thud, and the leader slumped forward, dead before he hit the ground. The others shouted in surprise, drawing their weapons, but it was too late. Tsunk was already moving like a blur in the night. His second arrow flew, and another man dropped with a howl. Panic rippled through the remaining attackers. They fumbled with their guns, their eyes wild with confusion. But Tsunk was already on them. He lunged at the third man, taking him down in one swift motion. His knife was in his hand before the man had time to scream, silencing him with a sharp cut across the throat. The last man, wounded and disoriented, stumbled backward, clutching his rifle. Tsunk could see it in his eyes. The fear, the realization that he was going to die. But Tsunk wasn't interested in making it quick. He was interested in making them pay. "You think you can take what belongs to me?" he growled, stepping forward. The man stammered, his voice shaking. Please don't." But Tsunk didn't hesitate. He disarmed the man with a quick twist of his wrist and sent him sprawling to ground, a knife to his throat. The man's pleading stopped when the blade pressed against his skin. Nina's voice reached him again, softer now. Tsunk, it was all he needed. His breath came in a sharp gasp, his mind clearing as he pushed the last attacker aside. He rushed to the back of the fort, following the sound of Nina's voice, until he found the small wooden door that led into the darkened room. There she was. Nina was crouched in the corner, her wrists bound tightly with coarse rope, her hair matted to her face, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief as she looked up at him. The sight of her, alive but broken, pierced through him like a knife. The rage he had felt toward the men who had taken her, the pain he had carried with him on this journey, seemed to collapse in on itself. But now, seeing her alive, seeing her waiting for him, the weight in his chest turned into something else, something stronger, something that burned with the force of his love for her. "Nina," he breathed, his voice hoarse with emotion. He dropped to his knees in front of her, reaching for the ropes. "You're safe now." She didn't speak, but her eyes filled with tears. He cut the ropes quickly, his hands shaking as he freed her. She collapsed into his arms, a sob racking through her body as she buried her face against his chest. I thought you wouldn't come for me," she whispered, her voice trembling. Tsunk held her tight, pressing his cheek against her hair. "I promise you," he murmured, "I will always come for you, no matter what." But even as the words left his mouth, the noise from outside grew louder. A shout, the sound of hooves. Tsunk stiffened, pulling Nina closer. The fight wasn't over yet. There were still men on the outside, still more to be faced. "I won't let them take you again," he said fiercely, his voice a low growl. They had no time to rest, no time to breathe. The storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. The cold night air stung Tsunk's skin as he moved quickly, pulling Nina deeper into the shadows of the fort's interior. Her breath was ragged, her body trembling from both the shock and the strain of her ordeal. The sound of galloping hooves and shouting voices grew louder, closer. They were coming for them, coming for her. Tsunk's heart pounded, but his mind was clear. He had freed her. That was the first step. Now, he had to get them both out of here. There was no time for second thoughts. No time to dwell on the way his heart twisted at the sight of Nina's bruised face, her eyes filled with a terror that he'd never seen before. He couldn't allow himself to linger on that. He couldn't break, not now. "Stay close," he whispered, his voice low and steady as he helped her to her feet. He could feel her trembling against him, her body frail after days of captivity. But he wouldn't let her fall. He couldn't. The sound of hooves grew louder, echoing through the narrow streets outside the fort. They were coming fast. Tsunk pulled Nina behind him, crouching low, keeping to the shadows as he moved toward the back of the fort, toward the gap in the wall he had noticed earlier. It was their only escape. But as they neared the opening, a voice rang out, harsh and desperate. "You think you can run?" The voice was familiar, the voice of the leader, now dead, yet somehow still lingering in the air. "You think you're safe?" Tsunk froze, his pulse quickening. The man was dead. But his words still haunted the night. Tsunk's grip on his knife tightened. "I won't let you go that easily," the voice continued, this time closer, growing more frantic. "You've made a mistake, and you'll pay for it." It wasn't just the leader's voice now. It was the remaining riders, their presence unmistakable in the sudden silence that fell. The horses stopped, the riders dismounting, their boots heavy on the ground. Tsunk's heart raced, the cold sweat of fear mingling with the heat of determination. He had to move fast, had to act before they realized where they were. He motioned for Nina to stay behind him, his eyes scanning the dim moonlight for any sign of movement. There, a shadow. He shifted silently, drawing his bow and notching an arrow in one fluid motion. A sharp breath, the snap of the bowstring. The arrow flew with deadly precision, striking the man closest to them in the shoulder. The man crumpled to the ground with guttural scream, but the remaining attackers surged forward, pulling their weapons. Tsunk didn't hesitate. He dove into the fray, his knife flashing in the moonlight as he struck the next man, taking him down with a swift, brutal motion. His body was a blur of raw power and honed skill. He had no choice but to end this now. Nina moved behind him, keeping to the shadows, but Tsunk could hear the soft sound of her breath, steady but fragile, like the beating of a wounded bird's wings. He wanted to turn, to tell her to stay back, but he couldn't afford the time. The attackers were closing in, and there was no more space for hesitation. Another man lunged toward him, rifle raised, but Tsunk was faster. He ducked, the rifle missing his chest by a hair's breadth, and with one fluid movement, he disarmed the man, sending him sprawling to the ground. Tsunk didn't wait for him to recover. He struck quickly, knocking the man unconscious with a brutal blow to the head. There were only two left now. The last two men were circling, their eyes wide with fear, realizing they were outmatched. They knew they had no chance against him, but fear made them reckless. They charged at once, both swinging their blades. Tsunk moved with the speed of a storm, his every movement deliberate, controlled. He dodged the first strike, bringing his knife down in a swift arc that disarmed the attacker. The second man came at him with a wild, desperate swing, but Tsunk stepped inside his reach, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it behind his back in one motion. The man howled, but Tsunk didn't relent. He held him, using his own weight to bring the man to his knees. He wasn't finished. With one last movement, a final strike, Tsunk ended it. The last of the men crumpled to the ground, unconscious, his body limp. Silence fell. Tsunk stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, the weight of fight settling on his shoulders like a burden. But it wasn't over. The danger wasn't gone yet. He could feel in the air, the tension, the remnants of the violence that had nearly consumed them both. His gaze swept over the fallen men, his chest rising and falling in slow, deliberate breaths. His eyes found Nina, who stood a few paces behind him, her expression still haunted, but alive. She was trembling, her face pale, but there was a light in her eyes, a spark of something that had been dim for far too long. It was there, that familiar strength, the woman he had married. "We're not safe yet," he said softly, his voice hoarse but steady. "We need to move." Nina nodded, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. The understanding between them was clear, deep as the river that ran through their land. She stepped toward him, slowly at first, then quicker as she gained confidence in the safety of their surroundings. Together, they moved toward the edge of the fort, past the bodies of the men who had once thought they could take her. They were free now, but the price of that freedom was etched deep into their hearts. As they slipped into the wilderness, Tsunk glanced back, one last time, at the burning wreckage of the fort. He had done what he set out to do. He had reclaimed his wife. But it was more than that. He had discovered something deeper, something that would carry them both forward. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about the love they had found amidst the ashes of war. Nina reached for his hand, her fingers trembling as they laced with his. And in that moment, surrounded by the vast, untamed land, they both knew they had won. Not just a battle, but something that could never be taken from them. Each other, together. They vanished into night, the horizon before them a promise of new beginnings, even in a world scarred by violence. The storm had passed. The dawn was theirs to claim.